In this video, I'm going to cover a bit about melody and harmony, and also our approach to writing chord progressions and melodies. Similar to the tutorial video we made about recording and arranging synths, I'm going to use our track Cobalt as an example to illustrate some of these points, as I think it's a useful way of explaining some of these concepts in a way that's relevant. Melody and harmony are huge topics to cover, and I kind of want to avoid this video turning into a music theory lesson, so instead I'm going to showcase some of these concepts in our production and songwriting. Just a small side note before we begin, people sometimes ask us if they should learn some basics of music theory to help improve their music, and to be honest, the simple answer is that it depends. There's so many examples of musicians nowadays, especially producers, who don't really have a clue what they're doing when it comes to actual music theory, like reading sheet music or whatever, but they have amazing ears for melody and harmony, and consequently still come up with incredible melodies and chord progressions. That naivety can be an asset, as you're potentially more likely to think outside the box if you don't know the rules of the game. Having said that though, on the other hand, you have the best jazz musicians who have an amazingly deep knowledge and understanding of music theory, but they sort of transcend that knowledge. In a way, learning it so deeply, it allows them to almost forget about it when it comes to actually playing and writing. Ultimately, learning and understanding music theory doesn't guarantee you'll become a better musician, composer, or producer, and from my experience, it really just comes down to the individual. For me, I began playing piano at a pretty young age, which was really helpful in terms of developing a playing technique and just developing a general familiarity with chords, scales, and other musical concepts. As I got older, I got really into jazz, and naturally that translated into learning a bit of basic jazz harmony, and I suppose building upon some of the more fundamental concepts that you learn within the classical framework. I'm definitely not a great player by any means, but I do really value the practice of being able to play an instrument, and similar to learning a language, learning some music theory essentially widens your musical vocabulary, so you have more options to communicate and express yourself through your instrument. When it comes to playing, I'm usually not thinking much about the theory behind what I'm doing. It's more just a case of hitting record and playing around. The same thing goes for our production and writing process in the sense that we're usually not thinking in terms of actual theory when we're making music. Will, especially, is absolutely someone who has never really studied much music theory, but is someone who has a really good natural ear for melody and harmony. Anyway, enough chit chat for now, so let's dive into it and have a listen to how Cobalt originally started. As you can hear, it's pretty different from the final track. You can hear some Rhodes and some of these noisy sine wave sounds that we ended up using in the finished version, but obviously it's a completely different tempo and groove. We have this basic chord progression being played by the Rhodes, which the bass and melody are based around. And this progression is made up of 4 chords. We have F major 7, E flat major 7, B flat major 7, and back to F major 7. And we've just put this progression together really quickly using a short recording of the Rhodes. There's this small section of audio here, and then we've also put that same recording into a simpler, which is Ableton's sampler. And we've done that so it's easy to change the sample start point. It can be useful to have these longer recordings with a bunch of different chord voicings in them, as once they're in audio we can chop them up and arrange them in ways that we might otherwise not think of if we were just jamming around. Next, we've added some bass guitar notes. This is playing D, C, G, F. With the bass added, each of the Rhodes chords now have a root note sitting underneath them, which changes the function of the chord. You might have noticed that the Rhodes chords, when played isolated, were major 7 chords, which mean they consist of a simple major triad with a 7th note added on top. And these notes being played by my little finger are the 7th notes, which are sort of additional notes on top of the chord to make it sound more interesting. They're not fundamental to the chord itself, so you can kind of think of them more like an embellishment just on top. If we ignore these 7th notes for now, then the fundamental Rhodes chords that we're left with are F major, E flat major, B flat major, and back to F. When the bass note is added, these Rhodes chords sort of transform into minor chords. Let's visualize that to see what's going on. With the bass notes added, you might be able to see that what was the highest note in our major triad chord is now actually transformed into the additional note, or the 7th note, of this new chord. If we now take this one step further and ignore these 7th notes again, we can see that the chord progression has been transformed. So we've gone from F major to E flat major to B flat major to F major, and that has been transformed into D minor to C minor to G minor and to F major. Here's the original Rhodes chords again. And the transformed chords with the bass notes. It still sounds similar, but the progression has actually been altered, so it's now much more minor. So just by changing the bass line underneath the Rhodes chords, we can alter the harmonic function of each chord. For example, turning major chords into minor chords. Since the Rhodes and the bass play at the same time, we hear the chord as a single unit. Lastly, there's a really simple melody on top, which is outlining a series of notes in the A minor pentatonic scale, A minor being the key that we're currently playing with. So we have this short loop, and much in the same way that I showed in the tutorial about recording synths, for us this is kind of a jumping off point for recording more stuff, basically with the goal of starting to flesh out the harmonic elements of the track, and creating new chord variations and progressions using these recordings. At this stage I've got the progression in my mind, and I've just started improvising on my MIDI keyboard, playing around with chords that are similar to the ones in the loop, and doing things like adding in extra notes here and there to change and extend the chords. This is all super rough, which doesn't matter, as the point of it is just to be a starting point. Once it's recorded, we will find bits that we like and start to chop it up. In the synths tutorial, we were working primarily with audio recordings, and you'll notice that this time I've recorded this with MIDI, as I think we wanted to use this MIDI with the Alicia Keys contact library, and also some other MIDI instruments. The same principles still apply though, in the sense that it's quicker to find little snippets of MIDI from these recordings that have been physically played, as opposed to drawing all of the MIDI notes in from scratch. If we skip forward a little bit in this improvisation, you'll start to hear some of what eventually became Cobalt. I also recorded some Rhodes, which we'll see more of later. Here's the next version of the project. The most significant change is that we've altered the tempo of the track, and it's gone from 140 to 184, which is actually 92 BPM in this case, as we're using a halftime beat. I don't recall exactly why we did this, but when we were working on Polychrome, we were also working on a funky 140 BPM track, so we probably wanted to switch things up a bit with this idea. At the time, we were also listening to a lot of stuff like Robert Glasper, Hiatus Coyote, and the early version of the track had lots of these neo-soul sort of chords in. So I think we were probably influenced by that whole sound and that kind of tempo and groove that we've gone for here. At this point, the project and the sounds in it are still fairly similar to the 140 version. We got this cool wonky groove going on, and the next step would have been to start using some of that piano MIDI that I recorded. You can see that we've gone through this long MIDI recording and just started to pick out chords that sound good together, and again harmonize them with the bass and bass guitar underneath. The MIDI recordings can just be a starting point for us too. For instance, if we hear a chord in our heads that's similar, we'll pitch notes up and down, and that's one obvious advantage to working in MIDI. We'll also try copy and pasting this MIDI into different channels, like you can see with these channels here. And we'll experiment with different instruments and effects to see what we like the sound of. So there's lots of these different versions, and really at this point we're still in the experimentation phase, trying different ideas to see what works and basically just iterating gradually across these little loops. In this version we've used the same MIDI to start sketching out a simple melody. This sounds pretty rough, and we would have just been trying to write something that worked well melodically over the chord changes, as well as working rhythmically over the drums and the percussion. Here's the final version of Cobalt. For the intro, we've taken that original piano MIDI improvisation and edited it down a bit. And we've done the same thing for the build here with slightly different chords. These chords have quite fancy extensions and voicings, so let's simplify them a bit to see what's actually going on. We're now working in the key of D minor, so let's quickly go over the notes in the D minor scale. We can turn these notes into simple triad chords using every other note in the scale. Let's take a look at the sequence of ascending chords again, but this time starting from the G. You might notice that this sequence is pretty similar to the progression in the build. The first difference is that we're adding more notes so that the chord sounds richer. Essentially it's the same thing though, in that these chords are serving the same function, we just have these extra notes or embellishments on top. The next difference is that instead of using the second chord that we'd expect in this sequence, the A minor chord, we're actually substituting that for a G major chord. This G major chord is outside of the D minor scale, so it's kind of unexpected. It also immediately follows the first chord, which is a G minor, so we create this nice sounding switch from minor to major. These ninth chords and switches from minor to major are a big feature of neo soul, and also something I like using when I'm playing. So these chords being played by the piano are really the foundation of the progression, and we've rolled off any higher frequencies to allow space for other elements to sit on top, like the Rhodes chords. And what we've done with the Rhodes chords is use a couple of instances of guitar rig to pitch them up and down an octave at the same time, and then blending that with the original signal. After that, we have another chain with some delays and some really heavy multiband compression on. And that's applying some compression to the mid-range frequencies. As well as quite a bit of expansion to the higher frequencies so that we can really hear all of the overtones in the original recording. Finally, there's a couple of simple melodic synth riffs. The first one, which you'll recognize from the original project. This is a really simple sound. We're just using a sine wave that's layered with a noise oscillator and then a really fast amplitude envelope and some short ping pong delay here. Let's move on to the main section. We have a few more Rhodes channels with the same setup, the ping pong delay being pushed into some multibanding. And we're taking tiny sections from this recording, in some cases in the middle of or at the end of a chord, like you can see. This is another one of those recordings that I would have made really early on in the process of the track. We also have another version of this sine wave with noise on top, and this time it's being really heavily compressed so that the higher frequencies cut through the mix. Then over here, the progression switches, and all that's happening is we're rearranging some of those chords that we looked at earlier, and they're just moving down instead of up. So here were those original chords in the D minor scale again, starting from the G. And we're just reversing that and moving down. We also have this ARP that plays through a lot of the track as a kind of background melodic element. The MIDI for this was taken from one of my Rhodes recordings, but instead of using the audio itself, we've used a really cool feature of Ableton, which is the convert audio to MIDI function. We can right-click on any audio file, and Live will analyze the rhythmic, melodic, or harmonic content of the file, converting it to MIDI. It's not always super accurate, but it's something we use every now and then, maybe as a starting point for writing a chord progression or a melody. For the second section of the track, another new chord progression is being introduced at the breakdown here. And again, we would have just put this together by chopping up this Rhodes recording and putting in chords that sounded good together. We're just using these ninth chords again here. So we have a progression of G minor 9 to E minor 9 to D minor 9 to G major 9. And for this second section, we wanted the focus to be more on these synth melodies. To emphasize this, we're using a sidechain gate on some of the other channels, which is receiving the audio from the melody. So we have these long Rhodes chords, which are outlining the overall progression. And we then gated this, taking the output of the melody so that we only hear these Rhodes chords when the melody plays a note. The same effect is also applied to some of the Foley, which creates this really cool glitchy effect. In addition to that, we also have this new synth playing the exact same melody, except we've shifted it a bar so that the two together are almost playing a call and response type pattern. To finish off the video, I want to put some of these concepts into practice in a quick demonstration, similar to what I did in our tutorial about recording synths. I'm going to use the same drums and percussion from Cobalt because I kind of want to stick with this neo-soul, hip-hop type rhythm to match the sort of chords I'm going to be working with. So I've made a recording of me playing some piano on my MIDI keyboard. Again, just improvising. And I'm going to chop these up and find some bits that sound good together and start trying to create a really rough chord progression. One of the advantages to playing sounds in MIDI as opposed to drawing them in is that you instantly get a more natural feel. As you can see, the transients of some of the notes are kind of spread out and all of the note velocities are different. Here's a few chords that I think sound pretty good together. So it's a really simple progression. It's only 3 chords and they're all major 7 chords. We have G major 7 to B flat major 7 to C major 7. Now, similar to earlier in the video, I'm going to add some bass notes underneath the piano to flesh out the harmony of the chords. Again, the piano's playing G major 7 to B flat major 7 to C major 7. If we then add bass notes a third below each chord, the chords transform into minor chords. We now have E minor 9 to G minor 9 to A minor 9. If we ignore these higher notes, you can see how the chords change from major to minor with the addition of the bass notes. The bass part is a bit boring right now, so I'm just going to hit record and play in some notes on my MIDI keyboard. Another thing that can be cool is to experiment with changing the voicings of chords. A voicing is essentially the distribution of notes in a chord, and where the individual notes are played in relation to one another. So far, I've been evenly spacing the notes along the keyboard in thirds, but by moving the notes around and actually changing the chord voicing, we can make the chords sound different and potentially more interesting. So let's take a look at these chords again and see how we can achieve that. For this first chord, the E minor 9, We can try moving this top note down an octave, so it's played with these notes instead. By moving it down an octave, we've introduced a really dissonant relationship between the G and the F sharp. They sound pretty extreme by themselves, but when they're played with the rest of the notes in the chord, we don't really hear that dissonance. Let's do the same thing for the second chord, the G minor 9. Moving the A, which is the 9th note in the scale, down an octave to sit directly next to this B flat. For the last chord, we could repeat this and just do the same thing as the previous two chords. Instead though, let's move the two top notes down an octave. So the G and the B, which are the 7th and 9th notes, will be played an octave lower. I'm also going to add in a D, which is another extra note or embellishment to add to the A minor chord. You can probably see that when I'm playing these new voicings, my right hand is moving around the keyboard less than it was before, which is one of the main reasons keyboard players use different voicings. Aside from that though, the proximity of the notes in relation to one another sort of creates a more intimate sound to the chord. Now I'll change these chord voicings in our MIDI. I've also copied this piano MIDI over to a Diva channel I've got set up as a way of reusing the original MIDI for another sound and to start to fill out the mix a little bit more. Now I'm going to start tweaking this initial patch. I'm also going to quickly low pass the piano, so it's sitting mostly in the low mid region of the mix. And also add a little bit of reverb so that it's sitting further behind the other elements in the mix. Next, I'm going to keep building on this progression by chopping up some Rhodes chords that were originally recorded for Cobalt. Again, this is to continue fleshing out the harmony, because we're making the progression a bit more interesting and building on the foundation that we have. Let's do a bit of processing on these chords to bring out the higher frequencies. Finally, I want to add some sort of melody to tie everything together. Same as before, I'm going to use the audio to MIDI function in Ableton as a rough starting point. Basically looking for some sort of phrase in a recording that might work as a melody, and then turning that into MIDI. Now that we have a few really basic notes, let's start to tweak the sound a bit. We'll go with something similar to the melodic sound that we used in Cobalt, which is just using a basic sine wave and a noise oscillator combination. So this is a good starting point, and if we were going to develop this track, we'd probably start to add some more interesting sound design and develop the progression a bit more, but I'm going to leave it at that for now. Hopefully this video has been clear and also been a good showcase of some of the ways we go about building chord progressions and melodies. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them below.